immediately after March 16th, there was a lot more focus and a lot more people were giving voice to concerns that they were hearing raised about protecting the Asian community, gun safety, these types of things. I haven't seen that concern parlay into any concrete action, and that's discouraging to me.
One of Georgia's Asian American legislators reflects on what's happened since the Atlanta area spa shootings this day 1 year ago. Good evening and welcome to Lawmakers on this day 29 of the Georgia legislative session. I'm Donna Lowry in Atlanta. We'll have much more on the anniversary of the spa shooting in this show, including interviews with a few of Georgia's 6 Asian American legislators. They'll talk about continuing to process the mass shootings last year, pushing for legislation they consider important, and recognizing the grassroots efforts necessary for healing and change. Also on the show, we'll look deeper into some recently passed bills and what they mean to Georgians, including stiffer penalties for protesters who commit crimes. But first, let's hear what took place in the legislative chambers on this day after crossover day from Capitol correspondent Brenda Waters. Hi, Brenda.
Hey, Donna, a big day in the governor's office this afternoon. He signed Senate Bill 910, also known as the amended fiscal year budget. The signing of the budget came with all of the pomp and circumstance one would expect. The fiscal year 2022 amended budget marks a restoration to pre-pandemic funding levels. The $30 million budget is an increase of nearly $10 million over the current budget.
This amended budget fully restores austerity cuts made to K-12 education during the COVID recession through more than $388 million. Gives our hardworking teachers, school nurses, bus drivers, cafeteria staff, and custodial workers a one-time salary supplement of $2,000.
In addition to education, monies will also go to corrections and health care.
This amended budget allows us to continue the journey of being the best state in the country to raise your family and run your business.
This is a good budget, one that invests strategically in priorities for a growing, thriving state.
On the one-year anniversary of the tragic Atlanta area spa shootings that took the lives of 8 people, the Senate's only female Asian American legislator paid tribute.
So on March 16th, 2021, a gunman shot and killed 8 people in a barbaric rampage near Atlanta. Their names are Sun Chung Park, Hyun Jung Grant, Sun Cha Kim, Yong A Yu, Xiao Jie Tan, Dao Yo Feng, Delania Yon Gonzalez, and Paul Andre Michaels. Of the 8 lost, 6 were Asian women. Many of us hearing the news of this mass shooting event were shocked, but some were less surprised than others. Because 1 year and 1 day ago, little more than 24 hours before the shooting took place, I stood right here in the well of the Senate and talked about the rising phenomenon of violence against the Asian American community in this country.
The Senate then got back to work passing House bills that were moved to their chambers after crossover day. Annual legislative updates on banking, controlled substances, taxes, and natural resources all easily passed. The Senate also passed HB 1302. This bill gives Georgia taxpayers an additional $1.1 billion in tax refunds for 2021 if they paid taxes in 2020.
Single filers would receive $250. Head of household filers would receive $375. And couples that are filing jointly would receive $500. Georgians with tax liabilities less than that would receive a prorated share of that. So if your tax liability at the state was $400 and you filed jointly, you would receive a $400 tax credit. House Bill 1302 is a fulfillment of our beliefs that when government takes in more money than it needs, the surplus funds should go back to the taxpayers. Ultimately, it's our citizens, not our government, that move our state forward, and they know best how to spend their hard-earned money.
It will take 6 to 8 weeks after the governor signs the bill before you would see that money. And in the House today, the victims of the shootings were also remembered.
A year has passed, and hate crimes against Asian people in our country has increased by 336%. So today, on this one-year anniversary, let us reaffirm our commitment to this fight against hate, racism, xenophobia, gender-based violence, and not just for the Asian community, but for the Black community, the undocumented, the LGBTQ community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and for all those who have been impacted by the same system of oppression that took away 8 lives last year.
And a plug for getting rid of the shift in time.
Apparently, springing forward this past weekend knocked some sense into the U.S. Senate, and you may have noticed yesterday they passed permanent daylight saving time out of the U.S. Senate. So now it goes on to the House of Representatives. Now I would venture to say that all of us in this room know at least 1 or 2 Congress people that we could reach out to and urge them to strike while the fire's hot. Let's get this thing done, and let's put it to bed once and for all.
And Donna, it was a long night last night doing crossover for legislators, but a very short afternoon. And of course, it also included today's sad anniversary, which you will have more on later in the show. Donna, back to you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. As Brenda mentioned, today marks a somber anniversary. Last year on this day, Robert Aaron Long killed 8 people at Asian spas in Cherokee County and Atlanta. Police say he bought the 9mm handgun the morning of March 16, 2021 in Cherokee County. He killed 4 people and injured a 5th person at a nearby spa before driving to Atlanta and murdering 4 more at another spa. He is serving a life sentence for the Cherokee County murders and awaiting trial in Fulton County on the Atlanta shootings. Tributes and remembrance events are taking place throughout the area, including one at the Georgia Freight Depot called Break the Silence Atlanta Asian Justice Rally. Family members, community leaders, and lawmakers spoke of the pain of the murders that they caused not just for the families, but Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders everywhere. There are 6 Asian Americans elected to the Georgia General Assembly, 2 senators and 4 representatives. 5 are Democrats, and there's 1 Republican. I had the opportunity to speak with 3 of them about the anniversary of the spa shootings, Senator Michelle Au and Representatives Marvin Lim and Sam Park. I started by asking each of them how they were processing the reality of the deaths 1 year later.
I'm processing it daily and have been since then, because we know that once an acute crisis or tragedy happens, oftentimes less attention is paid. And in this role, I've made sure to continue to pay attention to it, including the initiatives that we've undertaken since then. Of course, the approaching of the anniversary makes it more acute, but I think I speak on behalf of many in our community, if not all of us. We're always processing this.
I think it is still very raw for a lot of people, and a part of the reason that's still very active in our minds is that this nationwide phenomenon of violence and discrimination against Asian Americans continues, right? And maybe not to the degree that we saw last year on March 16th in terms of the lethality and the brutality and the scope of that incident, but around the country we're still seeing targeted violence against Asian Americans, and particularly against Asian women. So this is a piece of work that continues, and it's a moment that we can reflect on that and reflect on the work ahead.
So it got a lot of attention, sadly, because of what happened. Do you think a lot of people have just forgotten that this is an issue?
I do think it's faded from, public memory for a large portion of the population. I think that's part of what we have to work against. Immediately after the tragedy, we did try to parlay that grief and that energy and attention towards some legislative policy that we thought would have a more lasting effect, at least at the Capitol. And when you talk about if people have forgotten about it, I think that the progress on this legislation shows that people have sort of let it slip from public view.
We're continuing to see incidents of violence and discrimination across this country and around the world. against the Asian American community, which certainly is cause for concern. But this is not completely unprecedented. As an example, after 9/11, we saw an increase in xenophobia and Islamophobia against the Muslim community, and that unfortunately persisted for almost a decade. Given all the scapegoating that happened as we're hopefully moving beyond, this once-in-a-century pandemic, which did originate from China, but to blame Asian Americans, folks born and raised in this country for this horrific pandemic, is very unfortunate. But again, all the more reason that first we need to work together to really move beyond this pandemic, but two, take greater steps to protect all of our communities.
Immediately after the March 16th shootings, the AAPI caucus here, so that includes me, Representative Sam Park, Representative Marvin Lim, Representative B. Wen, and Senator Sheikh Rahman, dropped a slate of bills, 3 parallel bills on the House and the Senate side, to address some of the issues that came up with this tragedy. 2 of the bills had to do with law enforcement and increasing resources and training for law enforcement, specifically with respect to language outreach, in-language outreach, and being able to report these crimes and reach out to communities to make them feel safer. The 3rd piece of legislation had to do with gun safety, and that was having to do with a mandatory 5-day waiting period after purchasing a firearm to actually obtain the firearm. And this was, obviously, this is not anything new. Florida has a 5-day waiting period. Many states have a 5-day waiting period. The goal is obviously to diffuse these sort of impulse crimes and crimes of passion, to build in a cooling off period so that people who are seized with the impulse to buy a gun can't use it that same evening to kill 8 people, which is what we saw on March 16th. On the Senate side, these were Senate bills 308, 309, and 311. They were dropped just about a year ago, sent to the Public Safety Committee on the Senate side, and since then, nothing has happened. Nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean they have not even been heard in committee, let alone voted, let alone come to the Senate floor for a vote, let alone crossed over, right? And it's been a year. So that's a little bit discouraging because obviously immediately after March 16th, there was a lot more focus and a lot more people were giving voice to concerns that they were hearing raised about protecting the Asian community, gun safety, these types of things. I haven't seen that concern parlay into any concrete action, and that's discouraging to me.
I introduced legislation to impose a 5-day waiting period before you could purchase a gun. Unfortunately, the bill has not moved at all. The bill has not received a hearing, let alone move through the legislative process. And while I thought there was some initial hope, especially in that last year, Speaker Ralston stopped a bill that would have allowed more guns from out of state to come into the state of Georgia. Unfortunately, this is an election year. And what we're seeing, rather than common sense gun safety reform, we're seeing a loosening of gun laws because that plays well to a certain political base, which is unfortunate, and that is an issue in which we can't find common ground to make our community safer.
When we introduced the bills, particularly that they were at the end of the session, we knew that we weren't going to pass them that year. And approaching this legislative session, we worked all last year and continue to work on ensuring that we can implement those provisions, even in a non-legislative way. The 2 examples I'll give is with 911, Representative Wen and I spoke to the director of GEMA, the Georgia Emergency Management Association, to see what we could do again at the local level to ensure that our local police and 911 operators had access to contractors that would provide language access. And then with respect to the Georgia Public Safety Training Center bill, I and a couple of folks affiliated with nonprofits representing APIs, Latinos, Black African Americans, as well as immigrants, have been working to create a curriculum alongside GPSTC that they will hopefully implement, my hope is by the end of the year, for our law enforcement officers that go through GPSTC training to have culture and language access training.
The Asian American community, they're continuing to do what they've done before, which is, to work hard, to do the best they can, to protect their families, to give their families and the next generation every opportunity to thrive here in the state of Georgia. And I think with that understanding of that community strength, and the power that they wield. I think it's important for them to understand that, especially with all the big elections coming this November, in which that will be yet another opportunity for Asian American voters to help determine the future and the next steps that our state will take.
While we've tried to push the bills, I think the more important thing, to my point earlier about this is a multi-year effort. This is not just going to be done legislatively, but it has to go ultimately locally and through our agencies. So I don't see these bills moving forward, but that doesn't mean that action isn't happening and that my colleagues here on both sides of the aisle aren't paying attention to the issue. We do need more attention, but I'm grateful for the attention we've gotten. We continue to push it.
This is work that's been really focused on by a lot of our very strong community groups. I want to cite specifically CPACs and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, who've been doing really the lion's share of this type of work of reaching out to the community, resourcing efforts to increase reporting, increase safety for the Asian American community, and really not letting this issue go, right? Because I think we've seen a lot of times in the past that when there is a tragedy like this, mass shootings tend to get a lot of press attention in the short term, but then fade from public memory as other things happen. To not let this issue fade, because it is important to a lot of people, and this is a segment of the community especially that is, unfortunately, accustomed to having our concerns ignored. And this is a segment of the community that is often felt, especially in the political space, not seen, not heard, and really invisible to a large extent. So to keep doing that work and to keep that energy going, because these issues haven't gone away and the work continues.
My thanks to Senator Michelle Au and Representatives Marvin Lim and Sam Park for talking to me. Coming up next, two lawmakers join the show to talk about bills they recently passed. You're watching Lawmakers on GPB.
Cigna is a proud partner of Georgia Public Broadcasting and Georgia Lawmakers. Cigna's mission is to improve the health, well-being, and peace of mind of those we serve. More at Cigna.com to learn how you can help support your employees' physical and emotional well-being.
Lawmakers is made possible by Georgia Farm Bureau. With over 80 years of helping everyone understand the importance of agriculture in our state. After all, ag is Georgia's #1 industry. Food and fiber production represents over $74 billion in output of Georgia's strong economy. The Georgia Farm Bureau legislative team works to represent producers across Georgia at the state capitol during the session and year-round. Georgia Farm Bureau, the voice of Georgia farmers.
Georgia Humanities, connecting people and communities across Georgia to encourage conversation, education, and understanding. Find out more at www.georgiahumanities.org.
We are the Southern Environmental Law Center. At SELC, we not only take on the toughest environmental challenges, we win, forcing the removal of more than 250 million tons of toxic coal ash, defeating repeated attempts to bring offshore drilling to our coasts, and securing clean air and water protections for communities across our region. Your most powerful environmental defender is rooted right here in the South.
Welcome back to Lawmakers. Joining me now are Democratic Representative Patty Bentley of Butler and Taylor County and Republican Senator Randy Robertson of Catala, which is in Harris County. Representative Bentley, I'm so happy to have both of you here. I know you're returning, but we're happy to have you here this year. Let's start with you. You sponsored a bill, HB 1040, and it's kind of interesting because it's about taxes, right? It has to do with when it comes to transparency and accountability for some community groups. Talk about that a little bit.
Yes, House Bill 1040 passed out of the Budget and Fiscal Oversight Committee, and made its way through the Rules Committee to the House of Representatives, and it passed unanimously. Now it's on its way over to the Senate, and House Bill 1040 will hold community action agencies across the state accountable in order for the state of Georgia Department of Human Services to enter into a contract with community action agencies that has been tasked with eliminating poverty through the means of federal grant funding. In order to get a contract from the state, they must provide proof that they are current with their audit reporting to the Department of Audits and current with their reporting to the Internal Revenue. Yes, so it's a good accountability bill.
So to the IRS and to making sure they get audits. And when you say community groups, what type of groups are we talking about?
These are community action agencies, and there's about 20 across the state, and they serve various counties. And as I stated, they are tasked with eliminating poverty. And this all stemmed back through the President Lyndon Johnson's era as president. So they've been around for many years. They help families with weatherization, LIHEAP, which is the Low Energy Assistance Program. They also have the cooling program, and they've received so much funding to help families during the pandemic. But this bill, if become law, will, just as we require local governments to be current with their reporting to the Georgia Department of Audits and Accounts, the same will apply for community action agencies. So it's very simple. If you want to continue to do business with the state, you just need to handle your business and make sure you're current with your audit reporting as well as your reporting to the Internal Revenue.
Yeah, passed unanimously in the House, on its way to the Senate. So let's talk about some things in the Senate.
Yeah.
So Senator Robertson, very, very busy crossover day for you. Lots of bills. But you presented one that was pretty controversial, cracking down on people who commit crimes when they protest. So explain a little about SB 171.
Well, the primary purpose of SB 171 was not necessarily to crack down on people who protest, but to require the cities and the communities where the protests take place to provide safe places for the individuals that do want to come in and express their rights under the First Amendment. And so what we've asked is that especially cities, and we'll use a large city like Atlanta, that during the 2020 riots, we saw at a time when chaos ensued that the community leaders here in Atlanta, the elected officials, asked public safety to stand down. They asked law enforcement not to engage with those that were rioting, those that were vandalizing businesses, and also on a couple of occasions where residential areas were on fire or a local restaurant was on fire, they asked for their fire services to stand down. And so what this bill does is if a city during a riot tells their public safety not to protect the citizens who pay taxes to be protected, then the city could expose itself to civil liabilities for the damages done, not only to the businesses, but the injuries caused to civilians.
Yeah, and so critics have talked about it infringing on the right to protest. How do you respond to that?
It doesn't infringe at all. Actually, it builds safeguards and increases the opportunities for people to protest. I've participated in protests myself as an activist and also as a law enforcement officer. We had protests in Columbus, Georgia for years and years where 20,000 citizens would come and protest issues related to Fort Benning. And we were responsible for interacting with those protesters as far as making sure that they had safe places, making sure that they had restroom facilities, trash cans, everything else we could do for them. I've met with protesters throughout the country. I met with the Westboro family protesters that were out protesting military funerals and had the opportunities to sit down with these individuals and discuss the environment around protests. The legislation that I passed yesterday with 171 will make it so if somebody wants to come to Georgia and exercise their free speech, they can absolutely do it no matter what that speech is.
And one of the things is the definition. Some people have a problem with the definition of a protest is 2 or more people gather. It's like 2 people can protest?
The thing is it's 2 or more people gathered with the intent to commit a crime. There in lies the problem. As what happens during debate in our Capitol many times, punctuation doesn't matter. People will stop in the middle of a sentence and try to allow that to encompass what the legislation does, and it doesn't. Throughout this bill, the intent of the individual is what matters. And in law enforcement, it's the intent.
Okay. Well, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that with you that I know has been very dear to your heart. You, Representative Bentley, it's been 2 years since the world shut down because of the coronavirus, but the virus hit your family especially hard. You lost your husband to the virus, and our condolences. I think he passed away this past summer.
He did.
So let's talk about, now that we've said it, now it's been 2 years, how are you moving on?
I'm moving on by my faith and the prayers from my friends and family. And yes, COVID hit our family really bad. And when it passed, my husband's body, it left him in a really bad condition. And so the one thing that I would like to encourage the viewers, that if you're not vaccinated, to please consider getting vaccinated. We all know that I'm in the funeral business, and just recently I buried a 52-year-old pastor and a 26-year-old young man here in Atlanta from COVID because they were not vaccinated. So I thank everyone for your prayers and support during the passing of my husband, and he contracted the virus before the vaccination was available. But again, I thank everyone across the state for your prayers, your support, and your continued prayers and support for my family.
We'll certainly do that. I want to switch back to you, Chairman Robertson. You also had another bill that passed, among the others, on crossover day. Can you explain SB 504 and when it talks about felonies and bail?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we passed a piece of legislation that established bail-restricted offenses, and the vast majority of them were most of them were violent felonies and others. And what this was response to is in a lot of our cities, judges were allowing violent offenders to be released on their own recognizance. In other words, someone would be arrested for aggravated assault. They would go in front of the judge. The judge would set a bond at, let's say, $25,000, and he or she would allow the offender just to sign their name as if it were valued at $25,000 and walk out the door. And we were seeing in Metro Atlanta and other places where these individuals would be reoffending within days. We had one case here in Atlanta where I think a gentleman was released on 2 occasions for aggravated assault, and then immediately afterwards we had video of him shooting up an apartment complex with a rifle. And so to address that, we put some guardrails in that when judges assess these bonds, individuals had to make the bond. And so yesterday, under the recommendation of some things that came out of committees, we added some more of felonies under that to make the lines extremely bright for judges. So if you are arrested for a felony in Georgia, you post a bond. If you're arrested for a misdemeanor, in many cases, you're only given a citation or you're taken to the jail and fingerprinted, and you can be released without a bond. This is just focusing on those individuals who go out and choose to commit felonies here in Georgia.
Okay. And Representative Bentley, I want to talk about one more bill that you had passed, and that is HB 1278, sales tax for a specific, very specific. Talk about that. Of museums, civil rights museums.
Absolutely. House Bill 1278 passed the Ways and Means Committee, Sales Tax Committee, where I serve as the vice chair for the subcommittee on sales tax. And House Bill 1278 will provide for a sales tax exemption to construction material for expansion to the Civil Rights Museum here in Atlanta. But this bill, if it passes, will provide for sales tax exemptions for any museum that house artifacts relating to the Civil Rights Museum. And if they want to do any expansions or anything that's going to help with economic development, this piece of legislation will help in that regard. But it did make its way out of the Ways and Means Committee to rules, but we're still working on it. So hopefully Senator here can help us out over in the Senate with that.
We certainly hope so.
Yes, thank you.
I love all the collaboration. I want to thank you. It goes so fast. I want to thank you both for being here. I think we got in quite a bit. Not all 5 of your bills yesterday, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining us on Lawmakers. You can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter at GPB News using the hashtag GPB Lawmakers. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow at 9 a.m. on your GPB station for Political Rewind, hosted by Phil Nygaard. We'll see you tomorrow for Legislative Day 30. Have a good night.
All right, bring it in.
Coach Collier, I am so impressed. In addition to the scholastic standards at Georgia Tech, for the women's volleyball team to make it into the NCAA Elite Eight is amazing.
Well, and we tied our own record fate. We had 4 players in the All-ACC academic team, so our success is due to way more than just pure athleticism.
Like calibrating volleyball inflation pressure to achieve optimal mechanical response.
Or calculating coefficient of friction on our high-tech polyvinyl chloride playing surface in order to get just the right slide.
And not to mention using calculus and